Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this session where we are very privileged to be surrounded by so many talented and accomplished women in the field of science. My name is Lloyd de Silva. I'm the Director of Communications, and I was so excited to hear about this opportunity to hear from all of these rising stars and from, of course, our laureate in the L'Oreal program about their work in fundamental science as well as in applied science, which our world so desperately needs today in order to solve our problems. Why am I excited? Because first of all, I'm a mom who has a daughter who's in a remotely related scientific field. She's studying environmental science. And it's so important for us to have heroines that our children can look up to and try to learn from their paths of self-discovery as well as paths of really trying to break down stereotypes. So today we have the privilege of hearing from each and every one of you. We will start off with Professor Zar from South Africa, and we'd like to hear about your project, what you think distinguished your project to such a degree that it was noticed by the L'Oreal board. And then from each of you, if you wouldn't mind also commenting about some of the personal and professional satisfactions that you've derived from the work that you've done contributing to our world.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here and for these 2 days. And what we've had today was really very interesting. So it's really a privilege again to be here. So I'm Heather Zar. I work at Red Cross Children's Hospital, which is the biggest children's hospital in sub-Saharan Africa at the University of Cape Town. And my work has focused on some of the most pressing issues in child health, mainly on pneumonia, childhood TB, and on asthma as well, which is the commonest chronic communicable disease in children. And the broad context of and question of my work is, can we better diagnose, prevent, and treat these illnesses? Because they still cause a huge amount of children to die, and they cause a huge amount of child suffering throughout the world. And I'll just give you a snapshot of a few more details, because I know I've only got 1 minute, in terms of perhaps one of the most interesting studies that we're doing, which is a unique birth cohort study. This is a study of 1,000 mothers and their children, and it really asks the question, what are the determinants of child health? And I'm sure if you think about this, there are multiple determinants: where a child lives, their nutrition, what they're exposed to, what their mother's health is, both her physical and psychosocial health. And this is the question that this study attempts to understand, to generate new knowledge so that we can identify new ways of preventing and treating childhood illness. And so we've worked with 1,000 pregnant women, followed them through their pregnancy, through their childbirth, and are now following their children till they're at least 5 years of age, probably till they're adults, we hope, if we get funding. But around that, we can do environmental science. So we go into the children's homes before they're born and after they're born, measure exactly what they're exposed to, the living conditions. We can very carefully measure the germs, the microbiome. So we are able to do quite sophisticated microbiology and molecular biology. We can very carefully measure the mother's psychosocial health, the stressors that the mother experiences during pregnancy and after pregnancy. Nutrition, the micronutrients that children have, and so on. And putting these all together, we have uncovered quite novel information on new determinants of health, on how these work together, on what the causes of illness are, particularly early in life, and also the long-term impact of those illnesses. So, for example, we've now shown that early pneumonia, if a child gets pneumonia very early in life, they're then set up on a path for chronic disease, which leads probably to asthma. And so these kind of links, which mean there's a new prevention strategy that we need to work on. If you can prevent pneumonia more effectively, perhaps you can prevent the epidemic of asthma that we're seeing in children. That's just a snapshot of what we do, and hard to quickly describe everything, but that's my
Brilliantly done. 3 minutes. So, being a laureate means you also know how to follow instructions. Thank you very much. That was excellent.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. I am Rafaela Ferreira, a researcher from the Federal University of Minas Gerais in Brazil, and I work with drug development. What we want to do is to develop new medicines for some tropical diseases that are mostly neglected by pharmaceutical companies. More specifically, I've been working with Chagas disease, which is very prevalent in Latin America, with African sleeping sickness, more concentrated in Africa, and with Zika virus infection, which was more recently in the news. You might have heard more about it. And we want to develop drugs. That's quite a challenge. So to do that, we are employing some computational techniques to try to make this process more cost-effective and efficient. So basically, we do simulations in the computer to find out which experiments should have a higher chance to be successful in the laboratory. So that's the basic idea. We understand how these diseases work, what are very important proteins for the organisms that cause these diseases, and then we want to inhibit the activity of these proteins so that we would kill these organisms and cure the disease.
Bravo. Thank you very much.
My name is Anela Choi. I'm an oceanographer at the University of California in San Diego. And the easiest way to explain what I do is to ask a question. So who in this room eats fish? Raise your hand. A lot of people in this room eat fish. So we have fish on our dinner plates because that big fish ate a smaller fish, which ate a smaller crustacean, which ate a plant, which was fed by the sun at some point in time. And understanding that flow of energy through these predator-prey interactions is why we have fish on our plates. And the ocean is changing at a very rapid rate. All of these feeding interactions happen in an environment very far off from where we live, in the deepest parts of the ocean. And that's actually one of the last explored frontiers on the planet. It's akin to outer space, the deep sea. But what we're finding out is that humans are impacting this far-off environment, the deep sea, by polluting it, by fishing it, by warming its oceans. All of these impacts are showing up in the food webs, and eventually they're coming back onto our dinner plates through the consumption of seafood. And so that's really what I study. I've worked on a few things, like the transfer of mercury from coal-fired power plants that burns from the atmosphere and gets into the ocean and then travels through all of the fish as they eat. More recently, I've been working on plastic pollution. So when we use our water bottles and our shopping bags and things like that, a large proportion of that actually ends up back in the ocean. And we're finding that it's sinking down into the deep sea and being fed upon by all of these different animals. And through that same chain of interactions is coming back onto our dinner plates. And so that's what I work on, and it's a big challenge working in the deep sea. We work on a lot of big research vessels, and we use a lot of robots to go down into the ocean where we can't go. So yeah, that's what I do.
Hi, first of all, thank you all for being here and listening to us, and thank you for organizing this great training. So my name is Elena Fernandez, and I'm from Mexico. I work in the Advanced Genomics Unit of WIPO Staff. And what I study, it might seem a bit foreign, but in reality, I don't know if you remember in 2003 when we finished sequencing the human genome, that it was portrayed as this great panacea, like we won't have disease anymore. But one of the big surprises that came out of that study and several other studies in plants and animals is that there is a big chunk of our DNA that we do not understand. So we expected to have around 100,000 genes because, for example, in comparison to a worm, they have 20,000. But what we found is that we have about the same number of genes which we know that they make proteins like collagen in our skin or keratin in our hair. So we're really surprised because it means that we are very similar in that part, while our DNA only makes 3% of those genes that we knew, and the rest doesn't make proteins. So we have a big chunk that we don't understand very well. And for a long time was thought of, they call it even junk DNA, so something that is not really useful. But what we've been finding recently is that 62% of the genome gets turned into this molecule, which is RNA. So basically, what's interesting is as well, because when we do a comparison, and we're trying to find, for example, what parts of the genome associate with disease, we find that around 40 to 60% of those fall into this region we don't know. So all that introduction was just to tell you that what I do is to study that part of the unknown genome. We create programs to be able to identify which parts might be more important. So to do this, we compare, for example, in the case of humans, what we do is we compare with other primates, and we try to find parts that are not changing much. And that tells us what might be important. And we do that also, for example, with crops, when we're trying to associate, for example, plants that can resist drought, so then we can increase food security. And the idea is that we enable other researchers to not have to ignore that part of the genome, that they can also have some insight into what it might be doing and which parts might be worth exploring further experimentally.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Yukiko Ogawa from Japan. My major is material science, and my research is about magnesium. Magnesium is the most lightweight metal, and so there is a benefit if magnesium is used in many fields. But magnesium has a low ductility. Because of that, magnesium is used in a limited field. But we developed a novel magnesium alloy which shows high ductility, high strength, and shape memory behavior. There are no magnesium alloy which shows shape memory behavior. So I believe that there is a big impact to our life. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Danielle. I'm from South Africa, and my main area of research is looking at South African medicinal plants, so more specifically looking at whether they can be used for the possible treatment of cancer. So I'm looking at melanoma. I'm sure you all know that's the most deadly type of skin cancer, and it affects almost 360,000 people a year, and it causes almost 60,000 deaths. And what I'm looking at more specifically is whether these South African plants are able to stop the growth of these melanoma cells, or whether they are able to stop the spread into different parts of the body. So how it works is that when the cells start growing quite exponentially, they undergo a stressful condition, so they have no oxygen left to survive. And what they do is they give off a certain protein. And what this protein does is it signals blood vessels to grow closer to the cells, allowing for more oxygen and nutrients to reach these melanoma cells. And this then allows them to grow more and to spread more to different parts of the bodies. So what we are looking at is to stop that signal between the blood vessels and between the melanoma cells. And then once those have been stopped, are those plants able to stop the growth and the proliferation of those cells? Thank you.
I've never heard so many scientists who are such good communicators.
Thank you very much for the invitation and organizations. It's a beautiful city. I will back later. My name is Hiệp Nguyễn. I come from Vietnam, and I work in tissue engineering. And my department is biomedical engineering. And my work focus on making a smart gel which can stop bleeding and prevent the bacteria, also enhance the healing process. So imagine it's like a powder. So when you put in the liquid body or any water conditions, then it can form a matrix which can stop bleeding immediately. So the idea came out when I were very young. And you know that in Vietnam we are developing country, so we use the everything very not high quality as in your country. So the people usually get accidents. So and they transfer them to the hospital really far. So the patient got passed away because of they lost a lot of blood, not because of we don't have any emergency. So when I back home, I thought I figured out that I have to do something for the people living far in the hospital, and especially for the soldier or the boxer, and the people in the countryside, especially for Vietnamese people. So I created gel, which can be stored in every family, like it's like powder. So when you need to just put in the water and then put in the wound. That's all.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. It's an honor to be here for me, and thank you for invitation. I'm Anna Kudryavtseva from Russia. I'm a head of the laboratory in the Institute of Molecular Biology, named after Engelhardt. And also I work in the Department of Pathology in a cancer clinic. It's an oncological research institute. And the project which I applied for laureate competition is dedicated to rare tumors. In particular, it's so-called paragangliomas. And I work with head and neck paragangliomas. That's why it's rare tumors. That's why they don't have a lot of knowledge about these tumors. And only when they have some data about molecular and genetic mechanisms of formation and progression, they can find appropriate drugs. I work with head and neck paraganglioma, which is located in the bifurcation area of carotid artery. So now the only way for treatment is surgery. So you understand how it's dangerous to operate in such an awful zone, because you can touch the carotid artery, and this kind of operation connected with high risk of strokes, and patient lost a lot of blood. So that's why we hope that if we will know some molecular mechanisms, we will find drug in the future. And one more point, that's up to 40% of these kind of tumors are hereditary. So it's really huge percentage. And if we will create the database for particular mutations which can be reason for disease in future, it will be possible to recommend for such kind of patient in vitro fertilization to be parents of healthy children without these mutations. So we can add only one step before pre-implantation screening for this particular mutation which was found in parents, and it will help in future to get free of mutation embryo. And it's not all projects which we have in our lab. In this project with rare tumors, they are only in the beginning of our way. But they also have some projects which connected with plant genetics, for example. They have a lot of in Russia, they have a problem that during the summer period, they have some kind of seeds of trees, and it's a problem for people with allergy reactions, and also it can be reason for fire, and it depends on the sex of this, gender of these trees. So they know how to determine this gender, and that's why they can apply it, and we on the way to commercializing of these findings. And also we tried to create a test system, like in vitro diagnostic system, for particular stage of prostate cancer for the prognosis. So they don't have such kind of test systems in Russian Federation, and it's also can be used in practice. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Not only amazing communicators, but amazing breadth of ideas. I mean, the amazing ideas you guys bring to the table of solving the problems in the world is very inspiring.
My name is Ibtisam. I am from Tunisia and I work as a postdoc. So my research is focused on the interaction, the symbiotic interaction between legume plants and soil bacteria, with an emphasis on the role of antimicrobial peptides. So when the amount of the nitrogen become limited in the soil, plants make an interaction with soil bacteria and form a specific root organs that harbor nitrogen-fixing bacteria. So during this interaction, I found that plants produce a small protein that control this bacterial population. And the amazing thing is this plant protein are resemble to antimicrobial peptides. So they are a mine, a gold mine to be used as a therapeutic agent. So I start testing the antimicrobial activity and antimicrobial and antifungal activity of these plant peptides to be used as a new natural antibiotic. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Hello, everybody. I would like first to thank everybody for the organizing of this fantastic workshop. So thank you very much for giving us this opportunity. My research, I'm Arij Abu Hamad. I'm associate professor at the University of Jordan, Faculty of Pharmacy, and currently head of department there. My research is very interested in drug discovery, and in particular for this competition in the Lloyd UNESCO Fund, I decided to choose something for women because the prize was about women. So I'm hoping to focus on varicose vein. Let me just tell you a little bit about the disease. It's a very common disease, and the problem with this disease, it affects 1 in 3 people worldwide. The problem is many people will treat the early stages of the disease as a cosmetic problem. Say they won't seek medical help or try to find a treatment for it. And unfortunately, despite the common occurrence of this disease and the number of people affected by it, men and women, of course, because of the modern lifestyle that we are experiencing, the only option for treatment is surgical operation, several ranges of surgical operation that's mainly, it doesn't treat the disease, it just covers the symptoms, which is the appearance of these veins on our legs, and usually is associated with high recurrence rate. Within 2 to 10 years, it will usually return to the legs. So in my research, I will use protein crystallography as a method for drug discovery. And to tell you a little bit about protein crystallography, of course, the normal function in our body is maintained by the normal function of proteins. And what is fascinating about these proteins that they are very selective for their keys. So if you can imagine them as a locks, they have very, very specific properties for the keys. And the problem is if we don't know what is the key for these proteins, so we need to find a key to a lock that we don't know anything about it. And what protein crystallography allows us to do is to take images for the inside of this key. So simply because proteins are tiny, tiny, very tiny molecules, we need to have large number of them to be able to take picture for them. And we have them to be ordered and sitting in the same orientation. And then we need to use, that's why we need to use a crystallization form, because this is what a crystal is. So if you can imagine tiles, they will be ordered in the same direction, same orientation as the tiles on your walls, for example. And then we need to expose them to X-ray. And what X-ray does for the protein is exactly how it works in the clinic. We can see the bones from our side, from our hands without, it can penetrate the flesh, so we can see exactly the skeleton of our hand. And also in the protein, it works in the same manner. We can see the inside of these proteins, we can see exactly the pocket that we need to design this particular very selective key for it, and this will hopefully reduce the iteration time, the need for animal trials, and it will increase the chance for success to these diseases. So in my project, I will focus on protein that is responsible for the destruction of the veins wall and all the complication, which will hopefully not only treat the disease, maybe it will not be very useful in treating the disease, but it can be very helpful to prevent the damage to our veins. The most exciting thing, sorry, just give me 1 second to say this, is that it's the first time this research is being done in my country. So I'm very excited to transfer this technology to the student, and especially women who can't travel abroad to do this such advanced research in my country. Thank you very much.
Thank you all so much. I have to say, what's moving me most is not simply your intelligence, but your compassion. It's very evident that we need more women scientists, because the heart that you have for the problems in the world is what's going to make the difference. Thank you all so much, really, for caring so much and helping us move forward in progress.
We want to promote science among girls, young girls. So on that note, I want to ask you how old you were when you first noticed that you are interested in science, that you want to go into this field, and then who was it, if you had somebody who influenced you the most when you were young, when you were a little girl?
So I got interested in science when I was 15 years old. In my high school, they had this program that offered the opportunity to work in a research laboratory. So it was really, I didn't have anyone in my family who was a scientist, but there was the opportunity. I took it, and I got really interested and decided that, that's what I want to do for my career.
You know, I was in the first grade in the school. Then I noticed that I fall in love in science and in medicine science. So the people who give me an understanding what I loved was the medical doctors who treat me in the hospitals. So I started to find the reasons for different disease. I tried to understand the ways how to treat it. And for sure, the second person who was responsible for my career in science was my school teacher. She was a very intelligent older woman, and she gives me love to zoology, to botany, to everything. And that's all.
Sorry, I just wanted to quickly say I have maybe, I don't think I'm the only one, but my mom was my biggest influence. She's a scientist. She actually has 2 PhDs, which she did abroad, and she did break the glass ceiling. I mean, she comes from a really small town, so to me it was very, I didn't want to be a scientist until I was 17. I changed idea of what I wanted to study pretty much last minute. But I think it was because she's a scientist that I didn't think it was such a big change. I was like, oh, I can do this as well. So yeah, for me it was a big inspiration.
Just a comment, really, not to give a personal thing, but I think that also the notion of science has changed a lot. Whereas in the past we used to think of a scientist sitting in a lab, a very solitary kind of person. In fact, what you've heard today is science all over. Public health science, science in the community, science in labs, and the work I do, for example, is clinical science, but it is integrated with public health science and with laboratory basic science. So I think there's actually potential for science in a lot of what we do, and it's a way of looking at the world. And that's the message I'd give to young girls, that whatever career you choose, but particularly if you choose a career in social science or in medicine or in many of the areas we've heard, it's a way of questioning the world and of generating new knowledge and I think if we can teach that approach, that's really would be great for advancing science and also for advancing women in science.
I would like to know if you are in the front line of fighting cancer, for example, and you mentioned that 40% of those that have cancer is in the family. I would like to know if there is any trend to use artificial intelligence to analyze big sets of data in order to prevent cancer, in order to analyze the information of people that had cancer, or and in order to establish certain patterns that these people, victims of cancer, have somehow engaged into, in order to take prevention steps. So anything about artificial intelligence, neuronal networks, and...
Well, I like your question. Thank you very much. Actually, artificial intelligence is one of the promising fields in drug discovery. So it's work similar to what Rafaela do. What I mentioned about finding a key for a lock will benefit a lot from the computer science. Actually, there is a lot of computer-based drug discovery effort where you can either start with a compound that has activity and then try to find similar compounds that will fit into this particular protein. Or in such case that you don't have the key, you don't have a compound known to inhibit this particular protein, you can rely on the structure as I described of this particular protein. I know that many pharmaceutical companies are starting to initiate projects with the use of artificial intelligence because we can overcome the shortcomings of simple modeling and docking experiments, because usually in these experiments we can use several known molecules, for example, to build a model. But when we apply this to the chemical space available for us, which is very, very, very massive space with a different chemistry possible to synthesize, it's very hard to extrapolate. So we miss a lot of targets. So by the use of artificial intelligence, where the model can modify itself, I think we can improve this in an extensive way. So yes, I think there is a big hope. Already many pharmaceutical companies have started using artificial intelligence, and I'm sure research groups around the world as well.
A little bit about hereditary cancer and cancer prevention. Then I tell you that it's up to 40%. It was particularly about head and neck paragangliomas. So the real percentage depends on each particular type of cancer. And artificial intelligence is a potentially promising approach, but now it's mostly laboratory work. So we have a lot of databases, and they collect information about different mutations. They download it into the database with particular clinical information about the patients. So now they have a lot of information, and for some of mutations they cannot prove is it really the reason for cancer or for tumors or not. So in the future, when we will collect a lot of data, it will be better to understand, for example, should we prevent cancer in this particular case? For example, is it reasonable to recommend in vitro fertilization with genetic tests, or they can recommend to avoid some kind of environmental condition or kind of food and so on. So now they're on the way to this understanding, but they don't have a lot of information. So now it's a laboratory work, and work together with doctors, with clinic physicians.
Thank you for filling up this room with so much hope on issues that in some way or another are going to affect all of us or our families. So from environment issues, oceans and public health, antimicrobial resistance or other issues, cancer. My question would be, many of your institutions are publicly funded. The research is publicly funded. I guess your salaries are publicly funded. I don't know how many of your institutions do they have an institutional intellectual property policy that in case that you come to a great result, which I guess most of you have, or your institution will allow or will guide you on the issues related to intellectual property, and maybe you as scientists, you think, well, I am researching for public good. I would like that this will remain public. So how do you see the role of intellectual property, patenting, for example, and transferring your results to the private sector, for the private sector to take? There is one startup I saw somebody that already created a startup. But how do you see this process from leaving your baby, your result that goes to the private sector, pharma industry or other industries, to be further developed and commercialized and to be accessible, if possible, by large public? Thank you.
To answer the first part of your question, which is about my university, actually my university started to develop its intellectual property program. Still a lot is needed, so I think the knowledge that I will gain here will be very helpful when I go back home. In addition, I think the major obstacle, for example, for me being in a developing country, or maybe a country in transition, is the funding. I mean, it's very hard for them to distinguish the project that will, result in a revenue. And this is sometimes can be disappointing or frustrating for us as researchers. So sometimes they will, for example, register some invention or a compound, and then after 1-2 years, if there is no interest, they will just cancel the protection. And this is, I think, because we're just starting, so I'm sure we will mature eventually into a more successful thing. I think, like as a researcher, that intellectual property is really very important to give value to scientific research. I mean, eventually we want this research to be used by people. I mean, that's why we're doing all this work. And without intellectual property, many companies will not be interested. For example, in my field, in pharmaceuticals, they will not be just interested because it's available everywhere. I mean, the knowledge, I'm sure, will be beneficial for somebody to use it maybe and do something similar, or maybe to answer questions. But I think we need more, we need action. And that's why intellectual property will be very, very important. So something to really we should consider.
Thank you very much. I'm really impressed. But I would like just to ask you a question about the gap of salary between men and you, because it's currently the situation. How do you deal with, in particular in the country in transition, because I guess that is not easy at all. And I have a second question about the tradi practitioners, because in many countries, like in Africa, we do not have a lot of public fund, and I guess that you are closely working with the tradi practitioners as well, the ones who are the traditional healers or practitioners.
African representative, where Danielle, you can also talk about it. I think that's a very important point, so I'll take the traditional healer issue. I just want to say, in African countries, yes, there's a lot of use of traditional healers, but in high-income countries, there's also a lot of use of alternate healers, from chiropractors to osteopaths to naturopaths. So it's just a different take on another form of medicine or of seeking help. But to answer the African, to give you the African perspective, I absolutely agree with you that traditional healers are widely consulted by our populations. And sometimes we're able to work together with the traditional medical model and traditional healers. And South Africa has been doing this more and more effectively, I think. And sometimes not. So, I mean, there's certain illnesses where it's a clear medical illness that requires treatment. Diabetes requires insulin, right? Or HIV, for example, requires antiretrovirals. And I think where one can work with traditional healers to strengthen treatment, to provide a support system, that's fantastic. But where traditional healer is saying, no, actually my therapy is the way to go, that becomes problematic. But in principle, we try to work closely with traditional healers and to integrate them into the work we're doing, because this is what we need to do to provide, the best care. And I think China has done that brilliantly. They've got a two-tiered system, a parallel system where you can get a medicine as we understand medicine, and you can get Chinese medicine side by side, and there's a place for both. Sorry, your other question was about salary. Oh, salary. Look, I'm fortunate at my University of Cape Town, they don't distinguish between women and men in terms of salary. I do think, though, that in Africa it's a big issue, and starting even before salary, access to education for women and access into science for women is a very big obstacle in Africa broadly. And we have to advocate for much more equitable access for women and men, starting from school education, actually.
So concerning the salary gap, in Brazil, actually, they open a position already saying what the salary is, and it's a standard salary, regardless of where it is and whether it's a man or a woman. So in that sense, we have equality. Where it may become more of a problem is for the highest level. For most of the career progression, I think we don't have problems. But for the top level, there are still more men than women. And then they will make a bit more in those cases.
The condition in my university and in Jordan in general is very similar to what Rafaela has described. So when the job opened, there is no distinction between men and women, but again, with the extra time work and with the higher positions, it's usually women. So it's sort of indirectly biased toward men in the higher positions and eventually the higher income. And about traditional medicine, you said, I think, again, it can be a very useful mind, to be honest, to search for example, active compounds from nature. And this is one of the things that we should consider significantly. I mean, many people, they underestimate the power of some herbs or plants, but I think they can be, originally these were the sources of most of our effective medications. So I'm sure there is, in different places around the world, there must be a lot of secrets, in nature that needs to be explored.
We're so grateful to have the opportunity to get to know you and get to know the passions that drive you, and certainly we'll all take home some very inspiring stories of how much you care and how hard you've worked to get where you are. It's no small feat to master the knowledge that you have mastered, and we are grateful to you for bringing your knowledge to benefit society. Thank you all very, very much.